This devlog we're going to add a few new things to the game, including new fruit trees and also new pickable plants. Although honestly this ended up being a bit more of a bug fixing week as I ended up neutralising a whole stack of bugs, including some things that have been in the game for a bit longer than maybe they should have. This is a game about exploration and discovery in a high fantasy world. You discover things, find items, kill monsters, level up and gradually progress through the world. And I'm slowly adding stuff to the world, so it's becoming a bit more alive. I make a devlog each week and the best way to follow along with the progress of the project is to subscribe. And I'm sure no one on YouTube has ever told you to do that before. So let's start by talking about the palm trees. Okay, so there's a few different trees in the game at this point, but one of the kind of consistent things with them is that they all tend to follow a similar pattern. So they're extremely blocky and also just quite simplistic. So I've got alternatives like the cherry blossom one, and there's also just the regular green one. What I haven't really done is anything that's sort of any particular shape. So the palm tree was the first of the trees that kind of actually had a bit more to it than just actually looking like a tree. The problem, it turned out, was my limitation on the colour palette, because I only really had a few browns to choose from and none of them really kind of matched what I was going for. I'm going to have a think about what to do, because there are options. I've got more than 256 values in terms of the number of voxels, because I've upped it to 16 bits per voxel. So, I mean, I could use 1 bit or maybe even a few bits to have different colour palettes. For now, I'm just going to have to stick with this, I think. I mean, it looks like a tree, but it looks like some sort of weird tree. And bearing in mind that this is what the regular tree looks like, this is almost certainly too complicated. Should we see what it looks like in the game and then decide? Ironically enough, when I actually came to put it in the game, I did quite like how it looked, and you can kind of just scale it down a bit and it kind of matches what I expected. But yeah, you know, like trying to put the final detail in, like you can kind of see me doing that there. It's kind of it is a tricky one to model stuff. Nice, there we go. I actually don't hate it though. The colour scheme doesn't look quite as bad as I thought it would. The obvious next thing I wanted to do was get some coconuts on the tree, so I was a bit concerned because brown blobs on the tree might look a bit sus, but these turned out to look fine, and it's obvious what I'm trying to go for there, so yeah, it's not a bad look. Why is that happening? I think I know why that is. Because there's an item called the well, and then I named this thing the well, so it got confused which asset to place and just ended up placing that. That's hilarious. Where does it say read? It's not meant to be read. Now something went wrong with one of the recordings, so I don't actually have any live footage of me getting the coconuts to work. This is almost post-edit Other Mythos, and I'm here to do a live demonstration of what it looks like to pick a coconut in this game. You walk up to the tree, you click the pick button, which happens to be Z on this keyboard. Boop. There we go. What more do you need in life? And this is what the coconut looks like. I think it looks very nice. Now, in the theme of new types of foliage for the game, the next thing I wanted to do for this week was get some berry bushes in place. I mean, this is something like, if you were to run around Skyrim, you'd know the experience of finding some random foliage that you could pick. So I really wanted to get something like that in the game. The big problem I had was actually just making the berry bush look actually decent. Unfortunately, there just weren't really that many examples of things like this going well in the voxel format. Because it's a bit like you want it to look kind of square to make it look like a bush, but you also kind of don't want it to look that square. You can sort of see me having to mess around with some of like the stump and the actual leaves themselves, like the shape of it, like how well trimmed should the bush be? Should it be like a collection of round-ish objects? It was actually really tricky, and I spent a lot of time just going back and forth with this one. Like, this was by far the most complicated one I had to make, and yeah, it kind of annoyed me a bit. And then also there's some issues with the colour scheme, like you can kind of see me messing around with it a bit there, and but it just led to trouble. I did quite a few iterations of this. Ooh, oh god, they look rubbish, don't they? Ugh. Actually, let's put my hood down. I don't want to look too much like a gangster. Ugh. Do you know how hard it is to make round things in a voxel game? Do you know how near impossible it is to do that? Hey, there are my berries. Red and fruity. If you're wondering why you didn't see a time lapse of me making this icon, it's because it was left over from another game I made. With all that out of the way, now let's talk about the bug fixes. The map gen algorithm now places a selection of flowers, and each of those flowers now actually gives you the right item. Before, it only ever placed red flowers, and the code was also just hard coded to only ever give you red flowers, so I've worked around that, and now it's better. I've massively improved the stability for pausing the gameplay. The different screens used to call the function to pause and unpause the exploration state itself, just depending on what they actually needed. But this began to run into problems when I started to do things like nest screens on top of each other, because then the pause and unpause state just started to get in the wrong state entirely. So you're in a sort of different category where you still need to be able to signal to the exploration logic manager that it needs to unpause itself, but you also might not be like the final authority on how to actually unpause the state. Now you might be wondering, how did I end up solving that exploration problem? And I'm glad you asked, because it's actually not that complicated. You just swap the Boolean state out for an integer counter instead. Each time you have a screen that needs to pause the state, the system will just increment that value, and then each time you have another screen that needs to unpause it, you just decrement that value. And as soon as it reaches 0, then it will just unpause the state. You're checking to see if that exploration logic count thing has got to 0, and if it has, then just unpause everything. It's lovely. And what this means is that now if you read a book in the inventory and then shut that book, then nothing goes wrong. Exactly what I wanted. And I also did quite a similar thing for the input state system as well. So I'm very happy with that and it works well. So next bug, controllers can now highlight things in the secondary inventory grid. So that was in the case of like if you'd opened a chest or something, you'd get another inventory grid here. It used to be that the like locality of the different column things weren't like attached to each other, so controllers physically couldn't even move the highlight over to that other grid. That's now fixed. So I think one of the most annoying bugs that the game had at the time was that every time you'd get into any body of water, you would end up discovering whatever region 0 was. And the reason for that is that every single voxel has a region ID assigned to it, including the water ones. Now the problem was that as they're water, they don't have a valid land ID. So I set it to 0. The problem was that 0 is actually a valid ID. So it would lead to a case of as soon as you went into the water, you would just end up discovering whatever region 0 happened to be. And that was more of like an architectural conundrum. The fix was actually really straightforward, but the reason I put it off for so long was because I wasn't really sure what I actually wanted to associate the water ID actually with. As far as I'm concerned, I think it would be quite interesting to have different like regions of water that are, you know, different regions altogether. What I've ended up doing to fix this problem is just to find specifically a certain region ID for water regions itself. And then what that means is that you don't get like the fanfare of having triggered region 0, which often ended up being like a special region altogether if you were to go into a watery area. Guys, next one. Trees no longer spawn in rivers. If you think that sounds like a really stupid bug, the answer is yes it is, and also I fixed it a long time ago. All that really happened was it regressed. When I did some of the rejigging of the map gen quite a little while ago, all the checks that it does to make sure that the voxel isn't tagged as part of a river become obsolete, because like the last thing I do in the entire process is actually check for rivers. What I needed to do was generate all that stuff, generate the rivers, and then place the cactuses. Ultimately, that's what I've ended up doing. The problem is that that's now much less efficient, because what I'm essentially having to do is go through the entire list twice and determine all the biomes and stuff, and then decide whether to place stuff. So it's a bit annoying that I've had to do that, but you know, honestly, I think I would have had to have separated that stuff off at some point anyway. Like later on, I think the placement code is going to get quite a lot more sophisticated, so it's probably going to happen inevitably. And then the thing is that as soon as I put all that stuff back, then the tree placement code that checks for rivers just sprung back to life. So, I mean, I guess I can't really complain too much. Speaking of rivers, I also fixed this weird bug where sometimes like the mouths of rivers just weren't correct. Like it almost looked like the voxels were trying to crowd in a little bit on it, like it wasn't really being carved correctly. And the reason for that ended up being that actually I wasn't pushing the origin coordinate of the river as like a legitimate position to actually carve. And this is what you call a one-line fix, lads. Love it. I did do a few other things that were probably a bit too boring to talk about here, so please consult this list if you actually care. And actually I spent about an entire day this week just getting halfway through writing this tool, which dumps the entire scene, to a .obj file. And the reason for that is actually a lot of the thumbnails I make are rendered using Blender, because I can just kind of edit them a bit better and they just look nicer. So previously I've kind of had to hack around like getting the scene to actually make sense. So having a tool like that would be fantastic. It just ended up taking longer than I thought it would, and I know that's like the theme song for this channel, but even though ChatGPT wrote half of it and stuff, but it's just like I packed the vertices really weirdly in my meshes, and like you have to go through every single mesh and like export it to some sort of OBJ file compatible thing, and I had to like unpack vertices, like get them rid. It's just like And the plan for the next few weeks is quite exciting. I'm skipping gameplay for the next little while, unlucky. And I'm instead going to focus on doing some technical stuff for a little while. Specifically, optimization, which I haven't done for ages. And the game's getting really slow. It's running like a dead dog with diabetes. So I'm looking forward to get cracking on some of that stuff. I want it hitting 60 frames a second at all times, boys. 60 frames a second is the goal. It's the dream. I've got a face merging algorithm that is kind of in the pipeline. I think that should well be possible. And I've just got to slot a bunch of pieces together. I think it's perfectly doable. Hopefully I can get it done in a week. We'll see. And speaking of weird places, why not watch this video where I add graveyards to the game? That's where all the dead people live.